autumn wind carried the scent of blood and storm across Thornvale Citadel long before the riders appeared on the horizon. Leora felt it first, that sharp metallic tang mixed with something darker, something cursed, as she hung dampened linens in the servants' courtyard, her fingers stilled on the rope, and the silver in her blood answered instinctively, humming beneath her skin like a struck bell. The other maids didn't notice her sudden rigidity, didn't see her emerald eyes flare with flecks of gold as her wolf surged close to the surface, drawn by that wrongness on the wind. She released the linen and moved through the stone corridors of the citadel without seeming to hurry, her faded dove-gray dress making her invisible as always. Invisibility was a gift Leora had perfected in her 14 months of service at Thornvale. The other servants bustled past her without seeing her, too caught up in the commotion of what the guards were shouting across the courtyard. The Alpha King, returning from the border skirmish, wounded. By the time she reached the eastern gallery that overlooked the main courtyard, a crowd had already gathered. Healers in their white tunics, the pack beta, the council of elders, and a dozen hands reaching up to help steady the figure slumped across his horse's neck. Leora's breath caught. Alpha King Kyle Thornwood was a creature of terrible beauty, even in his state of deterioration. His massive frame was slumped, with a weariness that seemed to penetrate bone deep, his long black hair matted with sweat and something darker. Even from this distance, even through the autumn air, Leora could smell the curse hanging around him, like a miasma, acid and rot and something ancient and poisonous. Her stomach turned. Her wolf pressed against her skin, desperate and keening. "Bring him to the medical chambers," commanded the pack beta, a grizzled man called Hector, whose voice carried the weight of authority in Kale's absence. "And summon every healer we have. Now." Leora watched as they carried him down from the horse with surprising gentleness. His head lolled back, and she caught a glimpse of his face. Sharp, angular jaw, strong nose, those steel-gray eyes, now glassy with fever. His armor was torn on the left side of his ribs, and even from the gallery, she could see the wound. Black tendrils of curse spread across his skin like diseased veins, creeping up toward his heart and down toward his hip. The flesh around it was swollen and weeping, the smell of it reaching her even here, making her wolf whimper inside her. She shouldn't care. She should be grateful. An Alpha King without the strength to rule would mean a power shift in the pack, potentially an opportunity for her to escape this place, to disappear into the mountains where her kind could live in peace. But her wolf didn't care about strategic advantage. Her wolf only cared about one thing, and the recognition of it made her grab the stone railing to steady herself. "Mate," the word resonated through her like thunder, ancient and undeniable. Her silver-born senses had recognized him the moment she arrived at Thornvale 14 months ago. Though she'd managed to keep her distance, to maintain the careful fiction of her humanity. She was an Omega, and he was an Alpha King. The gulf between them was infinite, unbridgeable, and she was silver-born, a healer, a child of the old blood that the packs had nearly hunted to extinction. Discovery meant death, but she couldn't let him die. Leora turned from the railing and moved through the corridors toward the medical chambers. She lingered near the entrance, trying to appear as though she had legitimate reason to be there. A maid, perhaps bringing fresh linens. Through the partially open doorway, She could see the scene unfolding within. The medical chambers were a flurry of controlled chaos. Kyle lay on the examination table, his massive frame too large for the wooden surface, his muscular torso exposed to the cold air. The head healer, an elderly woman named Meredith, with steel gray hair and sharp, assessing eyes, and was directing her apprentices with the precision of a general commanding soldiers. The curse was worse up close than even Leora's distant perception had suggested. Those black tendrils seemed almost alive, writhing across his ribs and hip with a malevolent intelligence. The wound itself was horrifying. The flesh was swollen and weeping a sickly yellow fluid, the edges blackened and necrotic. The stench of corruption hung thick in the chamber, making even the experienced healers flinch. "Get me the purification herbs," Meredith barked, "the silver sage and the consecrated salt, and bring the healing poultice, the strongest we have. If we can halt the spread before it reaches his heart, we might have a chance." The apprentices scattered. A young man with an apprentice's white armband rushed to the herb stores, while a girl barely Leora's age scrambled to gather supplies, cloth, basins of water, tools for the initial cleaning. One of the senior healers, a broad-shouldered woman named Elise, was already preparing a cloth to clean around the wound. Meredith leaned close to Cale's face, studying his fever-bright eyes with concern. "My king, can you hear me? We're going to work on the curse now. This will hurt, but we need to act quickly." Cale's response was barely a whisper, his voice rough and broken. "Do what you must." What followed was an hours-long battle against the curse. Meredith and Elise worked with methodical intensity, applying poultice after poultice, chanting the old healing incantations that had been passed down through the healer lineages for generations. They used silver sage, known for its ability to cleanse corrupted magic. They mixed in consecrated salt, blessed by the pack's shaman. They even tried the rarest of their supplies, tears of the earth elf, a substance so precious that it was typically reserved only for the most critical cases. And the curse fought back. Each time they applied a treatment, the black tendrils seemed to recoil, to writhe in something like agony. But instead of retreating fully, they would regather, reforming themselves, the poison spreading deeper into his flesh, even as the surface appeared to improve. Kyle's body convulsed with the effort of fighting the corruption, his muscles tensing and releasing in waves of agony. Sweat poured off him, soaking the linen beneath him. His breathing grew ragged, and at several points, the apprentices had to hold him down on the table to prevent him from thrashing off. "It's not working," Elise said, frustration evident in her voice after the third unsuccessful treatment. "The sage slows it, but it doesn't stop it. And look at the edges. It's still spreading." Meredith's face was grim, her weathered features creased with worry as she studied the wound. She was silent for a long moment, her fingers hovering over Kyle's ribs, her eyes tracking the subtle movements of the curse beneath the skin. "This isn't ordinary poison," she said finally. "This is cursecraft, old cursecraft, something deliberately designed to resist our traditional healing methods. We're fighting against intent here, not just biological infection." "What do we do?" asked the young apprentice, his voice trembling slightly. "How do we fight cursecraft?" "We don't know," Meredith said, and the admission seemed to cost her. "Not in time. The curse is too sophisticated. It's woven into his blood itself. breaking it would require. She trailed off, shaking her head. Require what? Elise pressed. Silvercraft, Meredith said quietly. The old ways. The healing of the true Silverborn. But there hasn't been a true Silverborn in a century. They were all hunted to extinction during the Great Purge. Leora's heart had begun to race. She'd been hiding so carefully, maintaining the fiction of her humanity for so long that she'd almost convinced herself that her silver blood meant nothing. But hearing it named, Silvercraft, the true healing, something in her responded instinctively. And she watched from the doorway for several more hours as the healers exhausted their medical knowledge. They applied poultices and chanted incantations. They tried binding the wound with special cloths meant to contain corrupted magic. They even attempted a risky blood cleansing procedure where they opened a vein and let some of his poisoned blood drain out, hoping to physically remove some of the corruption. None of it worked. By the time the night deepened, Meredith had admitted temporary defeat. They'd managed to slow the spread of the curse, to halt its most aggressive advance, but stopping it completely remained beyond their skill. They moved Kale to a private chamber and set up watches. 2 healers would maintain a vigil at all times, monitoring his condition, applying fresh poultices every few hours, hoping against hope that rest and time would accomplish what skill and knowledge could not. He has 3 days, Meredith told the pack beta when the elder healer finally emerged from the medical chambers, her white tunic stained with sweat and a small amount of the sickly yellow fluid from the wound. Perhaps 4, if he has unusual strength. The curse is too powerful, and it's anchored too deeply in his blood. We can ease his passage, nothing more. Leora stepped back into the shadows as Hector's face crumpled with the weight of that pronouncement. She'd remained outside the chamber for nearly 4 hours, doing her best to appear inconspicuous while listening to every word, every desperate attempt. The healers' voices had grown progressively more anxious as each treatment failed. The apprentice's despair had been palpable, and Kale's gasps of pain had echoed in her mind like a death knell. As Meredith and the healers dispersed to the rest of their duties, some to prepare medicines for the long night ahead, some to rest briefly before returning to their watches, Leora slipped away from the medical chambers. Her mind was racing, her silver blood practically vibrating with urgency. 3 days. The Alpha King had 3 days, and the healers who had dedicated their lives to preserving life were giving up. She made her way to the small room where she slept, the cramped servants' quarters, with the narrow bed and the single window that looked out over the citadel walls. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the loose stone in the wall and retrieved her hidden journal. Her mother's journal, really. Though Leora had added her own notes and observations to its pages over the years, her mother had taught her well before the illness had taken her. The old ways of healing, the silver craft that predated the modern healer's knowledge by centuries, the understanding that certain corruptions required not standard medical treatment, but something deeper, a touch of the ancient blood that could recognize and unmake even deliberate curse work. Leora's father had been human, a scholar fascinated by old languages and older magics. Her mother had been one of the last true Silverborn, a healer of extraordinary power who had hidden away in the mountains rather than face the purge. They had lived simply, quietly, raising Leora in isolation. And when her mother had died, not to violence, but to the slow wasting of grief and longing for a world that no longer had a place for her kind. Leora had been left alone with a journal full of knowledge that she'd never intended to use. Using it now meant exposure. Using it meant risking everything she'd built here. The invisibility that had kept her safe, the careful distance she'd maintained from the world of the packs. But not using it meant watching the mate bond sing inside her, knowing that her wolf's other half was dying a few corridors away. Leora thought of the moment she'd first seen Kyle, when her silver blood had recognized him with a clarity that had taken her breath away. She thought of all the months she'd spent carefully not looking at him, not drawing his attention, maintaining the essential distance that was supposed to keep them both alive. She thought of his eyes, those steel gray eyes that were supposed to be cold and distant like the eyes of all the alphas, but which somehow held warmth when they'd met hers for that brief moment as she'd fled his chamber that first night after bringing him the initial healing. She couldn't let him die. Leora turned from the railing and moved through the corridors toward her small room in the servants' quarter. Her hands were shaking. Her mind was racing through the logistics like a merchant calculating inventory. The cursed blade wound. She'd heard the whispers among the healers. Whatever had given that blade its dark magic was beyond their capability. Curse breaking required ancient knowledge, silver blood, the kind of power that lived in the oldest of their kind. She had all three, if she was brave enough. The decision crystallized as she sat on her narrow bed and reached for the small leather journal with the brass clasp, the one she kept hidden beneath a loose stone in the wall. She pulled out a slip of paper where she'd written, in her careful hand, the formula her mother had taught her before she died. Rosemary and moonflower for cleansing, sage and silver ash for banishing corruption, and her own blood, silver and pure and ancient, to break the curse at its root. 3 nights, maybe 4, and she would know if it was possible, or she would be discovered, and it wouldn't matter anymore because they would burn her anyway. The sun set bloody red across Thornvale. Leora moved through the evening meal service with mechanical precision, carrying laden trays, collecting empty plates, making herself so thoroughly forgettable that even the cook's eye slid past her. She heard the snippets of conversation that filtered through the dining hall. The healers had said the wound was poison, that they had never seen a curse of this sophistication before. The poison was spreading through his blood. They could slow it, but not stop it. The Alpha King had perhaps 3 days, maybe 4. After the meal was cleared, she made her way to the herb garden at the back of the citadel. The autumn night was crisp and cold, the air carrying the scent of approaching winter and something green and vital. Her breath misted in the darkness as she moved between the raised beds. Here, in the shadow of the ancient stone walls, where the silver craft had once been worked openly, she gathered what she needed. The moonflowers were her first priority. These delicate, pale-petaled blossoms only bloomed at night, their white faces turning toward the moon with an almost desperate yearning. They were rare in the cultivated gardens of the citadel, but Leora had noticed them growing wild in this forgotten corner during her first weeks here. She'd kept that discovery to herself, knowing instinctively that she might need them someday. Now she carefully plucked the flowers that had just opened to the night, cradling them in her hands like tiny treasures. They smelled faintly of honey and starlight. and the scent alone made her silver blood hum with recognition. The sage came next, thick gray-green bundles of it growing wild along the citadel's ancient walls. The plant thrived in the cool autumn nights, its oils concentrated and potent. Leora stripped a handful of leaves, feeling the slight resistance of the stems, noticing how the leaves left dark stains on her fingers. This was the sage her mother had used, the variety that had been specifically cultivated by the silver-born healers centuries ago, before the purge had nearly wiped out both the herb gardens and the healers themselves. She needed the ash last, not common wood ash, but the sacred ash from the eternal fire that burned in the old shrine, the abandoned temple that stood on the citadel's eastern edge, a place most of the pack actively avoided. That fire had been tended by the silver-born healers once, kept burning as a source of purification and power. Most of the pack had forgotten its existence, but Leora had found it during her explorations in the early weeks, and she'd carefully collected a small amount of ash, storing it in a leather pouch that she'd hidden with her other supplies. She made her way to that pouch now, careful to move through the shadows, keeping to the edges of the citadel's outer walls where the guards rarely patrolled. The ash was cool and fine-textured, pale gray in color, and it seemed to hold the faintest residue of the fire's ancient power. She wrapped the herbs carefully in cloth, securing them with twine, and felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders like a cloak. What she was about to do could change everything. What she was about to do was an act of treason against the safety she'd carefully constructed. As she made her way back toward the interior of the citadel, she passed through the courtyard where Kale's horse still stood, being tended by the stable hands. One of the guards was there as well, and in discussing with the head stableman the condition of the mount, Leora kept her head down, kept walking, remained invisible. "The king's horse is as exhausted as he is," the guard was saying. "They rode hard, harder than I've ever seen, like demons were on their heels. And judging by his wounds, maybe they were." "Do you think he'll recover?" the stableman asked. His voice carried a note of hope that broke Leora's heart. "The healers aren't saying," the guard replied, "but I've been here 20 years, and I've never seen them look this worried. Whatever touched him, it was bad. Bad in ways that their herbs and incantations can't fix." Leora forced herself to keep walking, to not show any reaction. But inside her, the mate bond was singing a mournful song. She had to succeed. Failure was not an option. When by the time she reached her hidden room in the servants' passages, full night had fallen. The clock tower had chimed 9 o'clock, and the citadel was beginning to settle into its evening routines. She locked the narrow door to her small sanctuary and set about her work. The preparation was meticulous, exactly as her mother had taught her. She crushed the sage with a mortar and pestle she'd stolen weeks ago from the kitchen, mixing it with the silver ash until the two components were perfectly blended. The texture changed as she worked, the gray-green of the sage combining with the pale gray of the ash to create something that was neither one nor the other, something with its own distinct character. Next came the moonflower petals. These required a different approach. She placed them in a shallow stone bowl, the only bowl in her small room, a relic from before she'd claimed this space, and drizzled them with water from the blessed spring that ran beneath the citadel. Water that she'd collected carefully over months, knowing that true silver craft required pure, living water. As the moonflower petals softened and began to release their essence into the water, Leora felt her mother's presence strongly, not in any supernatural way, but in memory and knowledge. She could almost hear her mother's voice, soft and patient, guiding her through the steps. Silver craft is not power used against the world, my daughter. It is power used with the world. It works with nature, with blood, with the ancient understandings. When you heal with your silver, you are not imposing your will. You are reminding the body what it already knows, how to mend itself, how to be whole. Leora had been 12 when her mother had first taught her this ritual, the formal preparation for making a true healing poultice. They'd spent an entire night in their small cottage in the mountains, with the fire burning in the stone hearth, and Leora had learned every step with the seriousness of sacred ritual. Now, working alone in the darkness of her small hidden room, she felt the weight of that training. This wasn't just herbal medicine. This was silvercraft, ancient and potent, and it would demand a price from her. The deeper she went into her own power, the more visible she became to anyone sensitive enough to notice. She mixed the sage ash combination into the softened moonflower water, stirring it counterclockwise 3 times, the direction of undoing, of breaking what should not be, and then clockwise 7 times, the direction of renewal, of restoring balance. The mixture began to thicken into a paste, and it took on a faint greenish tint. The final step came as midnight approached. Leora sat very still with the poultice before her and gathered herself. She opened her awareness to the silver that lived in her blood, feeling it rise to answer her call. It responded eagerly. It had been so long since she'd used it openly, so long since she'd done more than suppress and hide this part of herself. She pricked her left middle finger with a silver needle, itself an artifact from her mother's collection. The metal worked in the old way, responsive to blood of the silverborn. The needle bit deep, and she felt the sharp, pure pain of it. 3 drops of blood fell into the herbal paste. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The mixture began to glow, faintly, barely visible, but unmistakably luminescent. Silver light, her mother had called it, the proof of her true nature, the mark of what she was. It filled the small room with a gentle radiance that seemed to come from within the poultice itself, as though she'd captured moonlight and bound it into herbal form. Leora stared at it for a long moment, watching the silver light pulse gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. This was the moment where she could still turn back. She could hide this poultice in the passages, could let the healers continue their futile work. And when the Alpha King died, she would grieve silently and alone as she'd learned to do. But the poultice glowed there before her, alive with power, alive with purpose, and her wolf howled inside her, desperate and furious and absolutely certain. "I know," she whispered to the empty passage, to the ghost of her mother, to the ancient blood that sang in her veins. "I know what he is to us." She carefully bound the herbal mixture into cloth, creating a small poultice that could be carried and applied. The silver light was still faintly visible, even with the cloth wrapping, so she secured it in a small leather bag and slipped it into the pocket of her dress. Then she prepared a small vial of water that she'd infused with several more drops of her blood, a stronger solution that could be applied to his lips if he needed rapid revitalization, a backup measure if the curse fought harder than she expected. By the time she'd finished, the clock tower was chiming midnight. Leora took a breath, steadied herself, and made her way toward the royal chambers. The route through the passages was one she'd mapped during her first weeks at Thornvale, when she was still learning the layout of the citadel and trying to understand the structure of the place that would be her temporary home. The passages were narrow, barely wide enough for a tall person to pass through comfortably, and they twisted in unexpected ways. The stones were cold beneath her bare feet. She'd removed her shoes before entering the passages, knowing that the silence would be essential. The darkness was complete except for the faint silver glow of her own blood-touched poultice, tucked inside the bag she carried. That glow was just bright enough to keep her from walking into the walls, but subtle enough that it wouldn't be visible from more than a few feet away. It felt strange to be here, with evidence of her power glowing against her chest. For months, she'd suppressed every hint of silvercraft, locked it down inside herself, and refused to acknowledge that it existed. Now she was carrying it openly, letting it shine, and with each step toward his chambers, she felt like she was removing a mask she'd worn for so long that she'd almost forgotten what lay beneath. The passage made a sharp turn to the left. She navigated it by feel and memory, her hands trailing along the stone wall to keep herself oriented. A servant running these passages in the old days would have had torches, would have had light. A servant in these times would have been invisible and wouldn't have needed them. But silver-born healers moving between chambers in service to the king, they would have had the kind of light that came from within themselves, the light of their own power made visible. She was walking in the footsteps of women she would never know, healers who had been hunted to extinction centuries ago, and their knowledge lived in her hands. Their power lived in her blood. The entrance to the royal chambers was hidden behind a tapestry in his sitting room, just as she remembered from her exploration weeks ago. She held her breath as she pushed it aside and slipped through into darkness. The chambers were enormous, a vast sitting room with a fireplace, a wardrobe room beyond, and the bedroom itself. She could see him from here, laid out on the enormous bed like a fallen god, his chest bare and his breathing labored. Leora's heart stopped, even dying, even fevered and pale. He was magnificent. His muscular frame seemed to take up half the bed, and the curse was worse up close than she'd imagined. The blackness spread across his ribs and hip like diseased veins, the wound itself weeping and swollen, the flesh around it hot and corrupted. The smell was overwhelming, rot and poison, and something that made her silver blood recoil instinctively. She moved to the basin of water on the table beside his bed and found cloth. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely wring them out. Up close, she could see his face clearly. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, and those eyes, closed now, moving rapidly beneath the lids as he dreamed fevered dreams. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, white and old, and she wondered what battle had given him that. She brought the damp cloth to his ribs and began to carefully clean around the wound. The curse recoiled at her touch, the silver in her blood hissing against it like acid in reverse, burning away the corruption. Kyle body jerked, and Leora froze. Her breath caught in her throat, But he didn't wake. His head turned slightly on the pillow, and he made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a groan, and settled again into his fevered sleep. The cleaning took nearly an hour. Leora was meticulous, careful, terrified that with each touch he would wake and see what she was, demand to know what she was doing in his chambers. But he stayed in his feverish dreams, his powerful body relaxed in sleep, his breathing gradually, evening as she worked. She could feel his wolf beneath the surface, could sense it with her own wolf through the connection that all Silverborn had with the shifters, and the great beast within him was suffering, thrashing against the bonds of fever and curse, desperate to heal but unable to do so. "Be still," she whispered to him, not knowing if he could hear her through the fever. "I'm here. I'm helping. Just be still." When the wound was clean, she applied the poultice. The moment her blood touched herbs, touched his skin, something happened. The curse screamed. She felt it like a physical thing, a recoil of malevolent energy that was almost visible in the darkness. And Kale's back arched off the bed. Leora pressed her hands gently but firmly to his chest, whispering the old words her mother had taught her, the silver speak that hadn't been heard in 100 years. "By the blood that binds the moon, by the power in the ancient stone, by the silver that will not break, I claim this wound, I break this curse, I heal what was meant to kill." Warmth flooded from her hands into his chest. His eyes flew open. For one eternal moment, their gazes locked. His steel gray eyes were now glowing amber, his wolf completely at the surface, and Leora saw the moment of confusion in those depths shift to something else, something raw and hungry and impossibly tender. "You," he breathed, and his hand came up, his large fingers reaching for her face. Leora ripped herself away from his touch and fled. She ran through the passage like something hunted, her breath sobbing in her chest, her silver blood singing in her veins with a frequency that made her want to scream. She'd been seen. He'd woken. He'd looked at her like she was everything and nothing, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. She reached her small room in the passages and collapsed against the door, her entire body shaking. She'd been so careful, and it had taken one moment, 1 second of weakness for everything to unravel, but he didn't come after her. By dawn, Leora had worked through the terror into a kind of determined acceptance. The first healing had worked. She could feel it in the way her silver blood was quiet now, satisfied, having accomplished part of its work. The curse would require multiple nights to fully break. She would have to return. The question was whether he would be waiting for her. The citadel was in a state of controlled chaos throughout the day. Leora moved through her duties mechanically, serving meals, cleaning chambers, making beds, and all the while listening to the whispers and exclamations of wonder. The healers were baffled. The wound was actually improving. The blackness had receded by a measure. The flesh was less swollen. His fever had dropped. They took credit for the improvement with obvious relief, and the pack began to celebrate. Leora caught a glimpse of him only once, when she was changing linens in the corridor outside his chamber. He was sitting up in bed, still shirtless, his dark hair long and disheveled across his shoulders. His eyes were tracking something in the room that only he could perceive, and when the healer approached him with fresh bandages, he sent her away with a curt gesture. His wolf, Leora understood. His wolf could smell her now. Her wolf answered from deep within her chest, and she was grateful for the moment when the older maid beside her distracted her with a question about laundry. That night, she almost didn't go back. The fear was suffocating. The certainty that this was a trap, that he would demand answers she couldn't give, that her life as she knew it was over. She sat in her hidden room and pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle the sounds of her own panic. Her heart was racing, her breathing shallow and rapid. Every rational thought screamed at her to leave, to gather her meager possessions and disappear into the mountains tonight, while she still had the chance. But the poultice would only last so long. The curse was deeper than one night's healing, and every moment she hesitated, the poison spread through his blood, eating away at him cell by cell. She could feel it from here, the way it tugged at her silver blood like a fish on a hook, demanding she complete what she'd started. There was also the matter of the mate bond. It was pulling at her, a constant, gentle pressure that made sitting still in her hidden room feel like pushing against a current. His wolf had recognized her last night. Her wolf had recognized him the moment she arrived at Thornvale, but she'd managed to suppress that knowledge, to lock it away. Now the lock was broken, and the mate sense was flooding through her like a tide that she couldn't hold back. She prepared a fresh poultice, pricked her finger again, and made her way back to his chambers as midnight approached. This time, she was ready for the fear. This time, she'd accepted that some things couldn't be resisted. The passage was still cold, still dark, still familiar. Her bare feet made no sound on the ancient stones. She moved through the darkness toward the exit that led to his sitting room, and with each step, she felt the pull of the mate bond growing stronger. This time, he was waiting. She could feel him the moment she slipped through the tapestry, the weight of his awareness, his massive body, utterly still in the darkness, his eyes tracking her movement with the precision of a predator. Leora's heart hammered so violently, she was certain he could hear it. "You came back," he said. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the full weight of his alpha authority. "I wasn't sure you would." Leora couldn't speak. She stood frozen, halfway between the sitting room and his bed, the poultice clutched in her trembling hands. In the faint starlight coming through the windows, she could see him clearly. He'd risen from the bed and was wearing dark clothes now, a tunic that hugged the powerful lines of his chest. He was standing, actually standing, without obvious difficulty, and the realization that her healing had already made such a difference made her chest tight. "Are you going to run again?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that wasn't anger or command. It was question, genuine and uncertain. "Or are you going to finish what you started?" Her own wolf surged forward, compelled by the bond, by the maid sense that recognized him on a level deeper than thought. She moved to his bed and, without speaking, began to unwrap the old dressing. The wound was better, visibly better, but the curse was still there, a dark thread woven through his blood, waiting. She could feel it, and the recognition of it made her work faster, more desperate. "You're silver-born," he said softly as she worked. It wasn't a question. "I can smell it now, like moonlight and old roses, and something that makes my wolf want to howl." "Don't," Leora whispered. Her hands shook as she applied the poultice, and this time he didn't arch away from the silver burning. He lay still, watching her with those amber glowing eyes, and let her work. Don't try to understand. Just let me heal you. Leora, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was like lightning striking through her spine. That's your name. I've heard the other servants call you. Leora. Silver. A light. She didn't know he'd ever noticed her. The realization was staggering. She'd spent 14 months being invisible, and somehow he'd seen her anyway. Somehow he'd known. The curse is deeper tonight, she whispered, applying pressure over his ribs. It's spread through your blood. I need to channel the healing deeper. It might hurt. Do it, he said, without hesitation. Do whatever you need to do. She closed her eyes and opened herself to her wolf fully for the first time since she'd arrived at Thornvale. The silver light flooded through her hands, and she felt it pour into him like liquid starlight, burning away the curse from the inside out. His body went rigid, every muscle taut, and he made a sound, not of pain, but of something surrendering, something ancient and necessary. What is your name? She asked as she worked, needing to anchor herself in something besides the mate bond that was singing through her blood like a siren call. Your real name? Before all of this? Kyle, he breathed. Just Kyle. That's who I am when the crown isn't on my head. That's who I am now, under your hands. That's who I've been since you walked into this keep 14 months ago and made my wolf go mad. The healers would return at dawn. Leora had perhaps another hour before she needed to flee back to the passages. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, exhausted from the effort of the healing, and let herself breathe him in for just a moment. He smelled like leather and pine and something wild and utterly him, and underneath it all, her own silver blood, which had begun to bind itself to his in the ancient way. I have to go, she whispered. I know, he said, and his hand came up to touch her hair, gentle and wondering. But you'll come back. It wasn't a question. The nights that followed fell into a pattern of determined secrecy. By sunlight, Leora was a ghost, invisible, moving through the citadel as though she had no substance. The healers continued their work with increasing confidence. The Alpha King's recovery was miraculous, they said. The best healers in the kingdom couldn't have done better. Already, barely a week after his return, he was asking to rise from bed, to take meals in the sitting room, to resume light duties. On the second night, he talked while she worked. She cleaned the wound, smaller now, the blackness receding further, and applied the poultice, and he told her about the border skirmish that had wounded him. A rogue faction, he said, wolves who rejected the new treaties with the human kingdoms, who wanted to return to the old ways. They'd caught him unawares, and one of them had wielded the cursed blade. He'd thought it was the end. He'd thought he was dying. And then I smelled roses, he said, his voice rough in the darkness, and I knew an angel had come. I'm not an angel, Leora said sharply. I'm cursed just like you are, Kale, just in a different way. Tell me, he said. He reached for her hand and held it gently against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating beneath her palm, steady and strong. Tell me what you are. But she couldn't, not yet, not with the whole citadel above them, waiting. So instead, she told him about her childhood in the mountains, and careful to leave out details that would betray her true heritage. She told him about the small cottage where she'd grown up, the herbs she'd learned to use, the instinct to heal that had been with her since birth. She didn't tell him that her mother had been one of the last, of the true Silverborn, that her father had been a human scholar who loved her mother enough to hide away from the whole world. She told him that her mother had died when she was young, and that grief had driven her to seek out work in a place where she could help others. She told him about the years of wandering, of learning to blend in, of becoming invisible. She told him these things in fragments and partial truths, and with each confession, the mate bond between them seemed to glow a little brighter. "You're not a servant," Kyle said. You've never been a servant." "I am exactly what I appear to be," Leora said carefully. "And I need you to never make me anything more in public. Do you understand? If anyone finds out that you recognize me as more than a maid, if they suspect what I am, I'm dead. We both are." The pain that crossed his face was terrible to see. "I don't know if I can do that, little silver wolf. My wolf doesn't understand invisible. My wolf understands mate." "Then your wolf will have to learn," she said, though the words nearly broke her. She worked on his wound as they talked, her hands becoming more confident with each night. The curse was retreating steadily now, pushed back by the silver craft that poured from her hands, held at bay by the poultice she applied each night. The flesh was healing, true healing, and not just the suppression of symptoms that the healers had managed. The infection was clearing. The swelling was reducing. Soon, very soon, the wound would be barely visible. On the third night, she found him awake and waiting, and this time, when she moved to the basin, he caught her wrist gently. "Let me see your hands," he said. She wanted to refuse, but the mate bond was strong now, singing between them like a silver thread, and she couldn't quite summon the strength to deny him. She opened her hands, and he turned them over in his, studying the thin silver scars where she'd pricked her finger each night, where her blood had risen to answer the call of his wound. "Your blood heals me," he said softly. "That's what you are. You're healing me with your own essence." "Only enough to break the curse," she said. "Once it's gone, I'll stop. Your body will complete the healing on its own." "And then?" he asked, and his eyes were so desperate, so hungry, that she had to look away. "What happens then, little silver wolf?" "And then I disappear," she said. "I take what savings I have, and I leave Thornvale. I go somewhere far enough away that the bond won't tear us both apart." His hands tightened on hers. "That won't work. You know it won't work. The bond doesn't work that way. We're mates, Leora. True mates. Distance won't break it. Nothing will break it." She knew he was right. She could feel the truth of it, singing through her blood, a fundamental recognition that predated consciousness. But she also knew something else, that the moment she was discovered, the moment anyone learned what she was, it would be over. The pack would burn her. They would burn him for protecting her. There was no future in this, except ash and sorrow. So instead of answering, she moved away from him and began to work. The wound was much smaller now, the blackness receding, the curse losing its strength as her silver blood systematically broke it down. 2 more nights, maybe 3, and it would be gone completely. She allowed herself to linger longer on the 3rd night, sitting on the edge of his bed for a moment while he rested between treatments. The chamber was quiet, except for the sound of his breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Through the window, she could see stars, the same stars her mother had taught her to read, the navigation points for those who lived outside civilization. Tell me something, Kyle said quietly. Anything. I just want to hear your voice talk about something other than healing and danger. Leora considered it. I saw a bird in the courtyard today, she said finally. A winter jay. They don't usually come this far south, but the cold has been early. It was bright blue, with a crest like a crown, and it was stealing the cook's bread from the windowsill. Kale made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. Did the cook catch it? No, I distracted her, dropped a plate of vegetables where she'd be sure to notice it. The bird got away with most of the bread. Leora smiled slightly. It was a small victory. You helped the bird, Kyle said, and there was something wondering in his voice, even though doing so might have gotten you in trouble. It was just bread, Leora said. And the bird was hungry. That's not why you did it, he said. You did it because you're kind, because you believe things that are small and wild deserve protection. Leora didn't answer, but she didn't pull away when he reached for her hand again, when he brought her fingers to his lips and kissed them gently. All the affection and tenderness that he couldn't express in daylight concentrated into that single touch. On the fourth night, Kyle was stronger. Leora could see the difference as soon as she entered his chambers. The way he moved, the way his eyes tracked her with perfect clarity, the way his wolf was less buried beneath the surface and more present. The healing was working. He was healing. She'd prepared no poultice for this night. She didn't have the materials, and besides, she'd known that he wouldn't need it. The curse had been broken down to its core, and his own shifter body would complete the rest on its own. She'd come only to tell him that it was done. But when she tried to leave without approaching the bed, he rose and caught her, pulling her against his chest with the strength that was returning to him. She was small against him, her head barely reaching his chin, her small frame dwarfed by his massive musculature. Don't run, he whispered into her hair. Please, Leora, not tonight, not yet. She should have refused. Everything about this was dangerous. Every moment they spent together compounded the risk. But her wolf had been patient for 4 nights, and her human heart had been patient for 14 months, and the mate bond was singing so loudly that she couldn't hear her own thoughts, so she stayed. They didn't speak much that night. They simply stood together in the darkness of his chamber, Kyle's large frame wrapped around her smaller one, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in. She could feel his heart beating under her ear, could feel his wolf at the surface beneath his skin, could feel the moment when his fever fully broke and his own strength returned completely. I love you, he said, and his voice held the gravity of an oath sworn before the moon. Leora wanted to weep. You don't know me, she whispered. I know everything that matters, he said. I know you're brave enough to risk your life to save mine. I know you're kind enough to hide it, to let the healers take credit rather than claim your own victory. I know you're silver-born and ancient and beautiful, and I know that you're mine in every way that matters. That's everything. That's all I need to know. The next day passed like a fever dream. Leora moved through her duties in a daze, and when she wasn't working, she hid in the servants' passages and tried not to think about what came next. The curse was broken. Her job was done. Kyle would heal completely now, and his own pack would come to him, would become the weight around his neck that kept him tethered to duty and crown. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to disappear into the mountains before attachment became something that would destroy them both. But the mate bond pulled her toward his chambers that night, and she couldn't resist it. He was waiting. This time, he wasn't in bed. He was standing by the window in full dark clothes, looking out at the night sky. And when he heard her enter through the passage, he turned to her with an expression so raw with feeling that she had to grip the door frame to stay upright. "The curse is gone," he said. "I can feel it. The last of it left my body this afternoon. I'm whole again. I'm whole because of you." "You're awake," Leora said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You know what I am. You know what I've done. You know that being with me, acknowledging me as anything other than a maid, is dangerous for you." "I do," he said simply, "and I don't care. I've spent the day in council, talking about border treaties and pact security and all the endless demands of this crown. And all I could think about was you. All I wanted was this night, alone with you. And so I could finally say what I've been trying to say through the darkness every time you were here." He crossed the room and knelt before her. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in 1,000 miles, kneeling before a servant girl. "I choose you, Leora. Curse, consequence, and all. I choose you." She stood frozen as he reached up and gently removed the silver chain from around her neck. Her crescent moon pendant came free, and he lifted it to the light filtering through the window. "Silverborn," he said wonderingly. "The old blood, the healers, everything they hunted to extinction. They missed you. They missed the most important one." "They'll come for me," Leora said. And now the terror was breaking through. All the fear she'd been holding at bay, pouring out like a flood. "If they find out what I am, they'll burn me. And if they find out that you've known about me, that you've protected me, then they'll have to come through me first," Kyle said, and his voice held the absolute certainty of alpha authority. "I'm placing you under my protection, Leora, not as a servant, as the future mate of the Alpha King, as a healer of the old blood, as someone whose life and person are as sacred as my own. Whoever comes for you will have to answer to me." "You can't do that," she breathed. "You can't just declare it. There would be questions, investigations." "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow there will be a formal announcement. I'll say that I've recognized you as Silverborn, that your healing gift saved my life, that you're being brought into the inner circle as a healer to the crown. I'll say whatever needs to be said. But tonight, you're going to stay with me, and you're going to let me take care of you the way you've been taking care of me." He led her to his bed, and they lay together in the darkness. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Thornvale Citadel, Leora allowed herself to believe in the possibility of survival. His arms around her were solid, eternal, the mate bond singing between them like a heartbeat shared by two souls. But even as she let herself drift towards sleep against his chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that this reprieve was temporary. The cursed blade had come from somewhere. Someone had wanted Kyle dead badly enough to risk assassination. And now that he'd announced her presence, now that she was no longer invisible, she had become a target as well. The danger hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. In the dark hours before dawn, when Kyle slept finally and peacefully, his arm heavy across her waist, Leora lay awake and listened to the wind outside the citadel walls. Somewhere in the night, she knew. Someone was learning the news. Someone was realizing that the cursed blade had failed. Someone was calculating how to finish what they'd started, and in the morning, everything would change. The invisible maid would become someone to reckon with. The secret would be exposed. The waiting would be over. For now, though, in this stolen hour before the world woke up, she allowed herself to rest her forehead against his chest and breathe in the scent of him, leather and pine and healing. She allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that true mates could survive in a world that hunted them. She allowed herself to hope. But even hope knew the shape of coming storms.